Wonderful. Okay, just checking. Everyone can hear me properly?
Loud and clear.
Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph McAuley. I'm a DPhil student at the University of Oxford in the Centre for Criminology, and I'm here to talk to you today about intimate partner violence amongst gay and bisexual men within England. Now, kind of leading on what Florence was saying, I have some connective tissue with the rest of these presentations, I'm sure, but I think there'll be a slight divergence here because a lot of my research and a lot of the research within my field generally is more considered with the issue of why a specific subgroup doesn't involve themselves in almost any way with the criminal justice system or the formal voluntary sector around intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And while there is some overlap, it's very, very slim. And a lot of my research is aimed towards understanding why these barriers exist and what we can do to help them. So, as I said, I study intimate partner violence amongst gay and bisexual men. And in my presentation today, I'm going to give some background and research context to the wider study of this phenomenon, my research and the research of other people. I'm going to set the kind of context about sort of the sociological sphere that gay and bisexual men inhabit in England and Wales, and the kind of history and context that they have to navigate in. I'm going to talk about the barriers that have commonly been identified to the recognition of abuse in these relationships and the barriers that exist towards leaving these relationships and engaging in helpful help-seeking mechanisms. I'm going to briefly touch on how COVID-19 has impacted or may be impacting, which I'll unpack a bit later, how gay and bisexual men are dealing with intimate partner violence. And then towards the end, I'm going to outline some kind of proposals for how I think we can perhaps tackle these issues and some of the challenges we face when attempting to sort of integrate with this and help this sort of very hard to reach population of victims. So I won't dwell too much on defining intimate partner violence, but intimate partner violence is a pattern, of course, of control. One person seeks to use various means to dominate, abuse, and control a romantic or sexual partner. I use intimate partner violence specifically in my research rather than domestic violence and domestic abuse, because within the literature on family violence for queer people, so lesbians, gay people, bisexual people, transgender people, non-binary people, domestic violence or domestic abuse oftentimes refers to both abuse that occurs from an intimate partner and abuse that occurs from a family member or relative. And in some of the earlier research, there's a lot of overlap between the two. I'm very interested specifically in violence from intimate partners, and then so I use IPV to sort of specify where my research is going. Now, I'm sure we all can recognize that historically, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, however you want to define it, has largely been considered a problem primarily experienced by heterosexual women. And we know from almost all the data we have that it continues to be an overwhelmingly gendered problem that is overwhelmingly experienced by women, overwhelmingly perpetrated by men. However, while this is the case, since about the 1980s and particularly in the 1990s, there began to be a consensus among researchers that this was a problem that actually did exist in the LGBT community as well. The first couple of studies from people such as Renzetti in the 90s began to discover that domestic abuse occurred within lesbian relationships, and some of the first research we have on all queer domestic violence was conducted in the lesbian community. However, sort of moving on from that point, researchers began to conduct research amongst gay men and discovered that similarly, it was a problem amongst this subgroup as well. Research into the experiences of gay and bisexual men has been particularly slow. This is due to a combination of factors, access being one. Part of the reason that domestic abuse within lesbian relationships was kind of identified earlier than gay relationships is that a lot of these researchers discovered, quote unquote, lesbian victims in pre-existing women's shelters. Obviously, due to the fact that there are very few sort of these accommodations for men, it was not as easy for these victims to be identified. And we'll also go on to explain why there's been a lack of identification more broadly. But we know that from more research that has been done since the 1990s, we've begun to know that domestic violence and intimate partner violence in LGBT relationships is kind of mirrors the kind of abuses that we see within heterosexual relationships. We know that there is what Johnson would classify as intimate terrorism, kind of course of control, as Evan Stark would call it, that occurs within LGBT relationships, and that it follows similar patterns that we've observed amongst heterosexual relationships, cycles of violence, patterns of control, escalations, and in some cases, lethal force being deployed against victims. We also know from a number of different studies and jurisdictions, such as the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the United States, that though there is a degree of variance in the levels of abuse reported, some studies going from 11% of a sample to 50% of a sample reporting some form of intimate partner violence. And there is a big debate within my field as to how exactly we're measuring domestic violence, as there is in all fields of domestic and intimate partner violence. The general consensus at the moment within research is that domestic violence or intimate partner violence occurs about the same rate in LGBT and gay relationships as it does amongst heterosexual relationships. Indeed, for gay men specifically, gay men have actually been found in a couple of studies that I've stumbled across to have higher rates of certain kinds of violence in heterosexual women. So in a study conducted by Safe Lives, which is a sort of a domestic violence charity, a study conducted by Gallup, which is a LGBT anti-violence charity, and a study conducted by Donovan and Hester in 2006. All of those studies found that gay men were at elevated risk of sexual violence when compared against gay women. And it does appear from other studies that sexual violence within intimate partner violence is a large problem for gay men and bisexual men, specifically even amongst all other subgroups, which includes heterosexual women. Now, despite the kind of progress that we've had in this research, gay and bisexual men remain a largely under-researched population within the research literature. And this is partly because of a general low level of reporting that gay and bisexual men have. They don't seem to contact the police, they don't seem to contact helplines, nor do they contact traditional domestic violence organizations, which means it's very difficult to get an accurate idea of exactly the scope of the problem. And in addition to this, there's a lack of understanding of how victimization is experienced, how victimization is recognized in these relationships, and then after this point, how exactly these men go to seek help. And that's largely what my research is primarily interested in. Now, I would argue that in order to understand why these kind of barriers exist, why there's a lack of reporting and the lack of help seeking or recognition, I think it's important to briefly consider the sort of situation and context in which gay men navigate their lives within wider society in the UK. So one of the sort of big things that's been noted in sort of sociological research on the position of gay men within society is just kind of the astronomical change that has occurred, even in the past sort of 20 or 30 years. Homosexuality for much of modern Western legal history was considered either a moral transgression in a religious or purely moral sense, or a medical disease or disorder, and was either dealt with punitively through the criminal justice system. It was a offence punishable by death for several hundred years in England, for example, or by treatment and discrimination, medical treatments that were not religious. Secular medical treatments for homosexuality as a mental disorder existed in the UK all the way up until the 1960s, included processes like electrocution and chemical castration. Homosexuality wasn't legalised until the 1960s in England and Wales, and not until later in Scotland. However, after the legalization of homosexuality, the gay liberation movement, which was then followed by the gay rights movement, made significant progress in advancing the normalization and acceptance of homosexuality within society. And this was largely done through a recontextualization of homosexuality, not as a moral failing or a sort of pathological mental health issue, but rather as a kind of an inherited trait. Gay people were just born this way. It's a natural thing. And therefore, they were deserving of legal protection and social acceptance. And this has been a broadly successful platform within the United Kingdom. There are now significant legal protections for gay people. Gay marriage now exists. Gay adoption exists. Levels of social acceptance for homosexuality are at an all-time high. And indeed, some researchers across Europe, particularly Rothing and Svensson in 2010, have coined the term homotolerance, which they describe as the attitude within many Western liberal democracies that acceptance of homosexuality as a sign of liberalism has become almost an accepted part of national identity and is prevalent across Europe and has been sort of recorded in discourse in the United Kingdom as well. Now, even though this is kind of like a rosy picture, it's important to recognize the limits of this kind of homotolerance that we are talking about here. We've not reached the point within British or European culture that stigma doesn't exist for sexual minorities, nor where they don't experience social problems related to their sexualities. So, for example, in Rothing's own study, the author noted that Norwegian gay youth, whilst recognizing a broad acceptance for their homosexuality, still reported alienation and depression that resulted from what they saw as their own sexuality. And this arose from their inability to construct a life course in which their sexuality allowed them to fulfill a fulfilling life into adulthood and beyond that. A lack of ability to construct what the authors refer to as futurescapes. In essence, these young sort of gay people in 2010 were unable to sort of think about what their lives would be like in the future because they had no role models in which to base themselves on. They didn't have a kind of heterosexual script of marriage and children prescribed from them. Moreover, recent research conducted by scholars such as Elder et al. Found that the self-schematics, which is kind of like the sense of self that you have for many gay men, prioritize short-term physical and sexual releases over their deeper emotional and personal connections, often to the detriment of their mental health as these individuals aged. In addition, another Norwegian study conducted by Cavallo et al., the authors found that pornography was frequently found to be used by gay men as a means to both model sexual relationships on and to boost self-esteem. And this is concerning given that in a separate study by Duggan and McCreary, those authors found a positive correlation between the use of internet pornography and increased anxiety around body image for men. And in a large study of gay and bisexual men carried out by the Center for Tropical Diseases on behalf of the charity Stonewall, they found that 1 in 5 gay and bisexual men suffered from some form of weight anxiety or eating disorder, and more concerningly, 1 in 6 gay men had harmed themselves in the last year. Now, I could go on to reference an even larger number of citations that show the many other social problems facing gay men, but it's safe to say that despite existing in perhaps the most gay-friendly period in modern history, gay and bisexual men still struggle with a variety of mental health problems that are exacerbated either by their status as a stigmatized minority or due to factors such as sexual pressure which exists within the gay community. And obviously, one of these problems is domestic abuse or intimate partner violence. Now, to bring us back to the discussion at hand, the same report that I mentioned, the one conducted by Stonewall, found that over 1/3 of the men interviewed had experienced domestic abuse from a male partner. And of that group, 4 of 5 of those who had experienced it had not reported the issue to the police. So we can see again, within the UK, there is a significant lack of reporting. And I want to consider the barriers as to why this might be the case. And I propose that we can conceptualize these barriers as existing in 2 sort of places: the barriers to recognizing abuse and the barriers to effectively seeking help for abuse. So to recognizing abuse, before you can begin to report domestic violence, you have to kind of recognize that you are being abused. And this may seem simple, but as we all know, one of the key factors that within sort of coercive controlling relationships is the ability of the abuser to undermine the victim's ability to recognize that what is happening to them is criminal. And often there is a process of normalization. Now, I'm sure we're all aware that this is a very difficult process for heterosexual women or children that are experiencing intimate partner violence. But for gay men, there's a number of different barriers specific to that group that may act as complicating factors. For one, a lot of the stigma around homosexuality historically, and still prevalent to this day in some respects, means that there isn't a lot of positive role models for young gay people to model their relationships after. To that end, it's more difficult for them to identify what is a normal homosexual relationship, and therefore it's easier for abusers in many respects to normalize abusive practices, particularly if they begin as psychological or emotional abuse, as just normal parts of a gay relationship. This is just what gay people are like. And because of this, abuse can be sort of normalized and made to seem just a part of the gay experience, which makes recognizing that what is happening to them is intimate partner violence very difficult. In addition to this, a lot of the discourse and talk around domestic violence and intimate partner violence has, quite rightly, due to the sheer numbers, focused on the experiences of heterosexual women who are victims. Because of this, there's often a lot of disbelief among some people, even within the gay community, that domestic violence even exists amongst gay men. Or that if it does exist, it's somehow not serious enough because the victims are men, that they should be able to defend themselves and not be victimized in that way. Because of this, there can be a disbelief, even amongst victims themselves, that they could ever possibly experience domestic violence. And because of this, this acts as a barrier to them recognizing that they're being abused in the first place. And I will say the number of times I've told people about my research and they've said to me, wait, that's a thing. Anecdotally, I've seen this a lot when I've been talking to people about it. Now, even if you do recognize that you're being abused and you wish to leave the relationship, if you want to report that you're being abused or seek some kind of formalized help beyond talking to your family and friends, there are additional barriers that you face as a gay and bisexual man. Now, one of these barriers is that a lot of reporting is done through the police or other criminal justice system agencies. And this is very difficult for gay men, as there has historically been a lot of enmity between the police and the gay and bisexual community. After all, the police were the main organ of the state that policed and regulated gay men during the period in which homosexuality was a criminal offense. And even after homosexuality became legal in this country, there was a long history of the police over-criminalizing gay community spaces, raiding gay bars and clubs, policing outdoor sexual activities, trapping men in acts of public sex and arresting them. And there's a lot of basically distrust. Also, there is some evidence that the police are still seen as a homophobic institution by much of the gay community, even though there have been significant changes to the way that the police is organized and the existence of LGBT-friendly organizations within the police. There is still some evidence as recently as 2013, 2014, that the gay community still overwhelmingly, particularly gay men, does not trust the police. And this may make gay men reticent to come forward to talk to the police if they do experience domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Moreover, even if they don't want to talk to the police and they want to talk to help organizations like shelters or domestic violence charities or councils, for example, for emergency housing, they are aware that they're not the ideal victims of intimate partner violence. They don't fit the way we think about intimate partner violence as typically being experienced by women. And we all know, I'm sure, the amount of difficulty that women experience in having their abuse recognized and legitimized due to sort of these ideas of the ideal victim. For gay men, they have to reckon with the fact that they may not be believed because it's believed that gay men just don't experience domestic violence. And because of that, they won't be taken seriously. Moreover, there is a significant lack of services specifically designed for men and specifically designed for gay people. And because of this, gay men may fear that if they go towards more mainstream services, they may experience some kind of homophobia or discrimination. Then this may act as a barrier for them coming forward to report, and they may wish to deal with it informally. Now, there is some evidence from the research that I would say to support the existence of these barriers. So in terms of preventing recognition, we can see Merrill and Wolf in their sort of study found that half of their respondents said that the main reason they didn't leave the relationship is they didn't recognize that the relationship was abusive. And 44% of these victims didn't even understand that gay domestic violence was possible before they were abused. And again, Cruz found that inexperience or naivety of intimate partner violence was the second most cited reason for failure to leave an abusive relationship, only surpassed by financial dependence. And interestingly enough, Donovan and Hester, based on their 2006 study, they argued that young LGBT people were particularly vulnerable to intimate partner violence due to a lack of positive role models for their relationships. And again, talking about that lack of recognition barrier. Merrill and Wolf, they found in that sort of same study that the vast majority of victims didn't utilize formal sort of support services, but instead utilized non-formal support mechanisms such as family and friends. And Donovan and Hester found that gay male victims distrust the police and perceive a high level of potential stigma from interacting with them. And again, these findings have been repeated again and again in much of the research literature, the limited part of it that exists. So, just because I'm conscious of time, I don't want to overstay my welcome. I want to briefly talk a little bit about how the gay victims have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the pretty bleak answer is that we don't really know. There's not really been any direct empirical evidence about the experiences of gay and bisexual men during the COVID-19 pandemic, which again mirrors the larger absence of discussions of this topic within the wider domestic violence literature. Now, obviously, in the UK context, there is a widely publicized and reported number of newspapers increase in domestic violence that has occurred. A lot of talk of helplines being overwhelmed, shelters being at capacity. But this is often discussed in the context of heterosexual women seeking help for violence committed against them by men, which again, I'm sure is undoubtedly the case. But we don't know much about if this is the case for gay and bisexual men. The organizations that primarily deal with these men, organizations like Gallup and Stonewall Housing, haven't published direct reports that they're being overburdened, but they have been releasing information suggesting that they are concerned that people are at greater risk. The LGBT Foundation, which is an LGBT charity, has argued that gay people are at a sort of higher risk of a number of negative health and social outcomes due to the pandemic, due to the fact that they are more likely to suffer from mental health issues, more likely to be homeless, and more likely to suffer from substance abuse problems, all of which are very precipitating and risk factors for experiencing intimate partner violence. On top of that, I did find a report from the New Statesman that talked that the Outside Project, which is a LGBT homelessness charity, has been reporting that they are at complete capacity and are struggling to deal with the number of homeless LGBT people they're having to deal with due to the pandemic. Now, this isn't for sure, but we do know from the research that homelessness for LGBT people, particularly LGBT youth, is often linked to violence at home or violence in an intimate relationship. And therefore, it could be the case that what we're seeing by a lot of these domestic charities that offer housing to gay people being overwhelmed is a bit of a runoff for people that are experiencing enhanced domestic violence or intimate partner violence during the pandemic. Unfortunately, like much of the research in this area, most of it is a lot of speculation because we don't have a lot of hard data and access. And during my research, when I conduct my field work, hopefully towards the end of this year and into next year, I may be able to ask about these questions to gain an idea of what the picture was like. So just to quickly finish up, how do we deal with this problem going forward? Well, there's a number of things that we can do. Firstly, there should be an increase in specific LGBT intimate partner violence services, which includes shelter and emergency accommodation for LGBT plus victims. Something that we specifically see when you ask victims, what do you want? They always say that LGBT specific services would have been very helpful for them in leaving the relationship. However, if we have these services, they have to be advertised properly because they do exist in small numbers even today. And because of that, there needs to be a more targeted advertising of these services within both queer spaces and within wider society. In addition to this, I would argue that we could see an increased use of education and visibility for LGBT plus issues from a young age in schools and in different parts of civil society. This will help people that are closeted, for example, be able to recognize these issues before they come out, and also make sure that the conversation is more in the public. If we can create a public story of this type of violence, it will make identification of these issues for young people who are in these relationships significantly easier. Now, in terms of academic work, there's a lot of research still needs to be done. I am very interested in examining how factors such as ethnicity, race, or class status might impact gay men, and if there are sort of hierarchies even within gay men and how they experience violence. And my own empirical research will hopefully shine a light on a number of the issues that I've identified. But I've spoken for far too long already. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Joseph. It was fascinating, mainly because of not only all the research and content you presented, but in my society in Trinidad and Tobago, homosexuality is criminalized. So all of the issues that you're raising, the UK is, although from what you're saying, much more could be done, the UK is leaps ahead of, most of the other jurisdictions where persons don't speak of these issues, is swept under the carpet, and therefore I would imagine services which are needed are under-resourced and perhaps will never be provided. It may not even be seen as a priority because it's not a topic that persons want to speak about, so to even consider. So I suspect in the UK, do you get the feeling resources are under distributed?
I think it's always difficult to say exactly under. I would say that there could definitely be more done, but then again, there could be more done in the wider domestic violence sector. I think the problem is in the UK is that there's a general lack of funding for all kind of voluntary services overall. And when it comes to something like LGBT domestic violence, which is kind of a smaller subgroup of a wider social issue, I think even if we argue that domestic violence provisions overall are generally underfunded, I would say definitely LGBT ones are underfunded as well. I think one of the big issues is the lack of visibility. It's not something that's generally talked about a lot outside of academic circles. I think a higher profile of visibility would help make people aware of the issue. Because I think there are services there. I think the problem is people don't know that they're there and don't know how to access them. It's one of the major issues. So I think tackling that first would be massively helpful. And then just wider accommodation and shelter for LGBT people specifically is kind of the main thing. Even if it's not domestic violence specific, more access to emergency housing for gay people would be very, very useful because some studies I've seen suggest that LGBT people make up at least a third or a quarter of the homeless population in the UK, which is a huge amount. It's a very large percentage. And I think that a lot of homelessness or accommodation precarity for gay people is often linked to some kind of violence, either in the family home or in an intimate partner space. So I think it's certainly a problem. And I think that's what needs to be tackled.